I had always believed that birthdays, especially milestone ones, were meant to be a joyous occasion, a night filled with laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the warm embrace of loved ones. And on my 40th birthday, I had expected nothing less than a celebration of all the years we had shared together. The venue, Le Blanc, was resplendent in its elegance, the soft lighting and tasteful decor creating an atmosphere of refined luxury that was meant to elevate the significance of the evening. I sat at the head of a long, beautifully set table, surrounded by our closest friends and family, their smiles and congratulatory chatter adding to the festive air as glasses clinked in honor of the occasion. I raised my glass in a toast to the past, to our achievements, to the love that had once bound us together, and I felt a flicker of pride in having built a life that was so cherished. Across from me sat my wife, Lena, whose eyes shone with a confidence that I had always admired. Yet, as the evening wore on and the atmosphere grew more convivial, I began to sense that something was amiss beneath the surface of the celebration. There was a subtle tension in her smile, an almost imperceptible glint of mischief that I could not quite place. Then, in a moment that froze time, she stood abruptly, drawing every gaze in the room to her with a deliberate air of theatricality. The music dimmed for a heartbeat, and a hush fell over the assembled guests as she raised her hand for attention. "I have an announcement," she declared, her voice carrying an excited lilt that promised something momentous. In that instant, I smiled, assuming that she was about to deliver a heartfelt toast, perhaps a tribute to our years together or a promise of future adventures. But before I could respond, her next words struck like a bolt of lightning. Leaning in as if to confide a secret only to me, she whispered, "It's laced. Say your goodbyes." The words barely registered at first, as if they had been delivered in a fevered dream, but then the reality began to dawn upon me. Lena's eyes, which had once been soft and familiar, now burned with a cruel resolve, and I saw, unmistakably, that she had taken drastic measures. Across from me, my friend and her new ally, Daniel, my best friend of many years, sat with a nervous shift in his posture, his smirk betraying a twisted pleasure in the unfolding scene. In the ensuing moments, as glasses fell silent and the ambient hum of conversation was replaced by shocked gasps and murmurs, Lena's declaration became a death sentence delivered with the precision of a master manipulator. "I'm leaving John," she continued, her words slicing through the room as if they were meant to sever the very bonds of our marriage. "And Daniel and I, we've fallen in love." A collective ripple of disbelief passed through our guests, their expressions oscillating between horror and a perverse amusement, as if my humiliation were the highlight of the evening. I could feel the tension of my father's dismay beside me, my mother's gasp echoing in my ears, and even my sister Rachel's grip on my hand tightened with the fury of a betrayal too deep to ignore. In that moment, the entire room, once filled with warm wishes and the promise of celebration, turned into a theater of my public disgrace. Daniel, emboldened by the gravity of his newfound alliance with Lena, couldn't help but smirk, his low chuckle a final, humiliating punctuation to her announcement. "Say something, man," he goaded, his tone dripping with scorn, as if daring me to respond. I stood up slowly, each movement deliberate and measured, as I adjusted my tie with a calm that belied the storm raging within me. I scanned the room with a cool, unyielding gaze, locking eyes with each person whose laughter and approving glances confirmed that my humiliation was their entertainment. In that charged atmosphere, with the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue, a slow smile crept over my face, a smile that was not born of weakness but of a calculated promise of retribution. "You'll regret this," I said softly, my voice steady and cool, each syllable a silent vow that I would not let this act of deception go unpunished. Then, without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a stunned silence and a room filled with voices that had once celebrated me now echoing with the sound of my betrayal. I stepped into the cool night air, each step measured and resolute, knowing that they had no idea what was coming next, that while they reveled in the spectacle of my public downfall, I was already laying the groundwork for a revenge that would make them wish they had never raised a glass in my honor. In that moment, My heart hardened into an unyielding resolve, and I vowed that every laugh, every toast to my humiliation, every triumphant smile of those who had betrayed me would one day be repaid in full, with consequences so precise and inevitable that the memory of this night would fade into the background of a future where I, and I alone, dictated the terms of my life. I sat alone in the quiet afterglow of that fateful evening, my mind relentlessly replaying the moment when Lena's venomous announcement had shattered every illusion I once held dear. As I navigated the turbulent sea of betrayal, I found myself drifting back to the early days of our union, a time when every word she spoke and every smile she offered had seemed imbued with the promise of a shared future. I remembered vividly the first time I laid eyes on Lena, how her vibrant intelligence and effortless charm had drawn me in like a moth to a dazzling flame. We met at a small, intimate gathering, a friend's art exhibition, where her laughter danced through the air as she discussed the intricacies of modern art with passionate fervor. In those moments, she appeared as a beacon of authenticity, a woman who could balance elegance with a raw, unfiltered truth. I was captivated by the fire in her eyes and the genuine warmth of her conversation, and I believed, with every fiber of my being, that I had found my perfect counterpart. Yet, as the years passed, the subtle hints of deception began to seep into our shared life. At first, they were almost imperceptible. An unexplained business trip here, a hurried phone call there, an envelope of lipstick-stained receipts that didn't quite match her usual modest expenses. I tried to dismiss these anomalies as the quirks of a driven woman whose career often demanded long hours and secret meetings. But deep down, a nagging doubt began to grow, a seed of suspicion that refused to be ignored. I recalled one particular evening when I returned home earlier than usual, only to find a lipstick-stained wine glass on the kitchen counter, a shade too bold to be one of her usual choices. It was a small detail, easily dismissed by anyone else, but to me it rang like an alarm bell in the quiet corridors of my heart. I began to notice patterns, late nights at the office that weren't explained by work, cryptic messages that she brushed off with a laugh, and the way her eyes would sometimes wander as if seeking something or someone beyond my presence. I kept these suspicions to myself at first, carefully tucking them away like secret scars hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. I would ask gentle questions, probing subtly into her whereabouts, and each time she offered an answer, I would nod and smile as though satisfied, all the while my mind mapping out a labyrinth of inconsistencies. It was during these solitary moments that I began my quiet investigation. I was not a man who relished confrontation. Instead, I turned to the methodical, almost clinical approach of gathering evidence. Tracking unexplained expenses, noting unusual phone calls, and even discreetly observing her behavior when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Each red flag, no matter how small, was logged meticulously. I even recalled the time when Mark, my best friend and confidant, pulled me aside in a hushed tone during a dinner at our favorite restaurant. He had said, "John, I'm not saying anything's definitely wrong, but I've noticed Lena's been spending a lot more on things that don't add up. You might want to keep an eye on it." I had brushed off his concerns initially, attributing them to my own insecurities rather than to any concrete evidence. But as more anomalies surfaced, the truth began to form. A truth that was painful yet undeniable. In the quiet of my study, while the city slept and the soft glow of my desk lamp illuminated pages of financial records and private messages, I pieced together the puzzle. I saw the pattern of suspicious business trips, the secret phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and the unaccounted-for sums of money that appeared in her expense reports. I remembered how Lena had always portrayed herself as fiercely independent, a woman who balanced a successful career with our shared life, and how her ambition had always been a source of admiration. But now, I saw it for what it truly was, a facade carefully constructed to hide betrayal. Every detail was a thread that, when pulled, threatened to unravel the tapestry of trust we had woven over the years. I could recall with a bitter clarity how, during one of our early anniversaries, I had looked into her eyes and believed in every promise she had made, never suspecting that behind that captivating gaze lay secrets that would one day shatter my world. As the evidence piled up in my mind, a silent resolve began to harden within me. I resolved not to confront her rashly in a moment of anger, but rather to continue observing, to gather every possible scrap of truth until the entire facade would collapse under its own weight. I began to record small details, notes on her unexplained absences, recordings of hushed conversations when I wasn't there, even the seemingly trivial residue of expensive perfume on an unaccounted-for coat that lay forgotten in our closet. It was a painstaking process, one that consumed sleepless nights and quiet moments of introspection, yet with every piece of the puzzle I collected, I felt my resolve solidify. I was no longer just the husband who had believed in the promise of love and partnership. I had become the keeper of evidence, the silent guardian of my own future. And as each red flag turned into undeniable proof of deception, I knew that the betrayal I had once felt in those small, subtle moments would one day come back to haunt her. The woman I thought I knew was revealing herself to be a master of disguise, a woman whose passionate exterior masked a cold ambition and a capacity for deception that I had never fully understood. The early days of our love were now a distant memory, replaced by a growing awareness that the person I had fallen in love with was, in fact, a stranger. And while the pain of that realization cut deep, it also steeled me for what was to come. I began to see every small betrayal not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern, a web of lies that, when fully exposed, would leave no doubt about her true nature. In the silent solitude of my nights, I made a promise to myself that I would not let her deception destroy me. Instead, I would use it as a catalyst to reclaim control, to secure my own future in ways she could never have imagined. And so, with every piece of evidence gathered and every secret noted, I embarked on a quiet investigation that would eventually become the foundation of my ultimate plan for retribution. A plan that would forever change the course of my life and force the truth, in all its unyielding clarity, to emerge from behind the mask of the woman I once believed I knew. I began to unravel the threads of deceit with the quiet determination of a man who had finally resolved to expose every secret that had festered in the shadows of our marriage. And as I sat alone in my study with a stack of documents and a heart heavy with the weight of betrayal, I embarked on an investigation that would soon reveal a web of lies far more intricate than I had ever imagined. Every suspicious expense, every unexplained business trip, every secret phone call became a piece of evidence in the puzzle of Lena's double life, and I meticulously recorded each detail, determined to uncover the truth that she had so carefully hidden behind her alluring smile. One evening, after returning home earlier than usual, I found a lipstick-stained wine glass on the counter, a shade that was bold and out of character, a subtle but undeniable sign that something was amiss. That single detail was the spark that ignited a relentless pursuit of the hidden truth, and I began to dig deeper into the financial records and personal communications that had always been a quiet background to our everyday life. I scrutinized bank statements, expense reports, and even private emails, each one revealing small inconsistencies that, when viewed as a whole, painted a picture of systematic deception. Lena, the woman I had once thought I knew, the passionate, intelligent woman who had captivated me from our very first meeting, was gradually revealing herself to be a master of disguise, weaving a tapestry of lies to hide her secret liaisons and ulterior motives. I discovered evidence of unexplained business trips that she had conveniently attributed to work obligations, and I recalled the countless times I had heard her mention clients in vague terms, never elaborating on the details. My suspicions grew stronger when I found a series of texts on her phone, messages filled with cryptic language and flirtatious undertones that hinted at a relationship beyond our marriage. Every message was a dagger to my heart, yet also a clue, urging me to follow the trail. I began to trace the origin of these messages, learning that they were coming from an unfamiliar number associated with a high-end penthouse in the city. The penthouse itself, a luxurious haven that I had never seen before, soon became the focal point of my investigation. With careful precision, I arranged for discreet surveillance of the building, and it wasn't long before I saw a familiar figure entering and leaving at odd hours. The realization struck me like a thunderbolt. Lena was not alone. Inside the penthouse, I later discovered traces of another man, a spritz of expensive cologne lingering on the door handle, an extra set of men's clothes tucked away in a hidden closet, and most damning of all, a concealed drawer filled with love letters addressed in a tender, flowing script signed only as T. The letters were explicit, each one a declaration of forbidden passion that betrayed an intimacy I had never shared with my wife. I recalled a wealthy investor named Travis, a man whom Lena had frequently mentioned with an air of admiration, and my mind began to piece together the dark truth. She had been meeting him in secret, indulging in an affair that had been meticulously hidden behind the guise of legitimate business. As the evidence piled up, my anger mingled with a cold, calculated resolve to let her deception be exposed. But I knew that confrontation in a burst of rage would only fuel her cunning. Instead, I embarked on a quiet, relentless campaign of documentation and observation, recording every conversation, every subtle hint that Lena had left behind. I kept detailed notes on the timing of her absences, the locations she frequented, and the names of the individuals who had come into her orbit. My best friend Mark, whose quiet warnings I had once dismissed as overprotective, now became a trusted confidant. He urged me to be patient and to gather indisputable proof, insisting that the truth, once laid bare, would speak for itself. Together, we pieced together a timeline of her clandestine activities, a tapestry woven from stolen moments, secret rendezvous, and half-truths told in hushed tones. I began to see the intricate web of lies that Lena had spun, each lie a deliberate attempt to conceal her true intentions and to maintain the illusion of a devoted wife. It was as if she had built an entire parallel existence, one that existed solely to satisfy her ambitions and to secure a future that had nothing to do with the life we had built together. Every detail, from the unaccounted-for expenses to the suspicious phone records, pointed to a calculated betrayal that cut deeper than any single act could have. I found myself oscillating between despair and a growing sense of empowerment, realizing that while the pain of her betrayal was raw and searing, it had also awakened in me a determination to reclaim control over my own destiny. The evidence I gathered became not only a weapon against her duplicity, but also the cornerstone of a plan that would eventually transform the scales of power in my favor, ensuring that every secret, every lie, would be exposed and that I would no longer be the unsuspecting victim in our shared downfall. With every new piece of information, I felt the foundations of my old life crumble, replaced by a quiet, unyielding resolve to build something new from the ashes of deception. As I continued to document, to record, and to connect the dots of her web of lies, I began to realize that the betrayal of the woman I thought I knew was not an isolated incident, but a carefully orchestrated series of events, a cascade of calculated moves that had been planned long before I ever suspected the truth. And in that revelation, I found both the source of my deepest pain and the spark that ignited my transformation. I resolved then that I would not confront her with anger or despair, but with the cold, undeniable power of truth that I would use to reclaim my future, no matter how bitter the cost. Every lie, every hidden expense, every secret rendezvous had led me to this moment of clarity, and as I sat in the quiet solitude of my study, the flicker of the city's lights outside a reminder that life continues even in the darkest times, I vowed that the web of lies would eventually ensnare its weaver, and I, with all my carefully collected evidence, would be there to ensure that justice was meted out precisely and without remorse. I began to notice the cracks in Lena's carefully constructed facade with an intensity that both chilled and fueled me. Over the course of several weeks, as I continued my silent investigation, I observed her elaborate tapestry of lies unraveling in small, almost imperceptible ways. It started with the way she would often excuse herself from our dinner table, claiming to have clients waiting on her at fancy restaurants. I recalled the time I had seen her speaking animatedly on the phone, her tone shifting rapidly from professional to conspiratorial, as if she were orchestrating something behind closed doors. Each secretive conversation, each hushed whisper over what she termed business, only deepened my growing suspicion that she was leading a double life. Determined to uncover the full extent of her deception, I decided it was time to set a trap of my own. I made a calculated decision. I would leave town on a supposed business trip, creating the perfect opportunity to install surveillance at home without arousing her suspicion. My departure was executed with the calm efficiency of a man who had long prepared for this moment. I told her I had urgent meetings to attend out of state and that I would be unreachable for a few days, a statement that, in her eyes, confirmed my commitment to work and did nothing to betray the quiet storm raging within me. Behind the scenes, however, I had arranged for discreet cameras to be placed in the living area, the corridors, and even the bedroom, all positioned to capture every moment of her secret life. With my absence now confirmed and the cameras silently recording every move, I waited, my mind a maelstrom of anticipation and calculated resolve. A few days later, while I was in a nondescript hotel room far from home, I began to review the live feeds on my laptop. The screen flickered with images that would soon become irrefutable proof of her betrayal. It started innocuously, a shadow crossing the hallway, a door opening quietly, but soon the footage revealed the pattern I had feared. One night, as I watched intently, the screen showed Lena returning home at an unusually late hour. There was a palpable intimacy in the way she moved, a secretive air that suggested she was not alone. My heart pounded as I zoomed in on the figure accompanying her. A man whose expensive cologne and confident stride could only mean one thing. It was Travis, the wealthy investor whom Lena had mentioned in passing on numerous occasions, always with a note of admiration in her voice. I watched as Lena let Travis into our home with an ease that I had never witnessed before. They exchanged smiles that were far too intimate to be mere acquaintances. The camera then captured a scene that struck me with the force of undeniable betrayal. In our own bedroom, Lena and Travis sat side by side, their posture relaxed and disarming as they laughed together over a bottle of wine. The wine glasses, which I recalled were the same ones we had used on our wedding day, clinked softly in a toast that seemed to mock the sanctity of our vows. The intimacy in that moment, her hand resting gently on his arm, his eyes reflecting a warmth that once belonged only to me, sank into my soul like a dagger. I watched the live footage over and over, each replay etching the memory deeper into my consciousness, until the image of Lena's betrayal was burned into my mind with surgical precision. As the days passed, more recordings confirmed what I had long suspected. I saw Lena engaging in secret phone calls, her face set in a mask of feigned innocence as she discussed plans that now clearly involved Travis and perhaps other unnamed individuals. The more I watched, the more the carefully maintained mask began to slip. There was a moment when I observed her, standing alone in the foyer, her expression caught between a forced smile and a fleeting look of uncertainty, a moment that revealed the cracks in her carefully curated image. I could see in that brief flicker of vulnerability that the perfect lie she had been living was beginning to crumble. It was then that I knew I could no longer allow this deception to continue unchecked. The evidence was overwhelming, the betrayal undeniable, and I resolved in that instant that Lena would not walk away unscathed. The live footage had provided me with every detail I needed, every nuance of her interactions with Travis, every hidden conversation that proved her duplicity. I had captured the truth in all its painful clarity, and now I was ready to use it as the final piece in my carefully orchestrated plan of retribution. My mind churned with cold calculations as I reviewed the recordings late into the night, each frame a testament to the lies that had once been hidden behind her charming smile. The betrayal was complete. A woman I had once loved had built an elaborate web of deceit, not just to mask her infidelities, but to secure a future that was entirely her own, even if it meant betraying everything we had built together. With every new piece of evidence, I felt the ice in my veins solidify, a quiet, unyielding resolve taking root deep within me. I knew that confronting her with anger would only play into her hands, so I chose instead to remain silent, to let the truth gather strength in the shadows until the moment was right. And that moment was fast approaching. By the time I returned from my fake business trip, the evidence was irrefutable. I had everything documented, the secret phone calls, the surreptitious meetings, the hidden drawer filled with love letters signed T. The moments captured on camera where Lena was seen indulging in the warmth of Travis's company. I was armed with the truth, a truth that would not only expose her betrayal to our shared world, but would also serve as the catalyst for a complete reversal of power. I knew that I could not allow her to continue her charade. The mask she had so carefully worn was now irreparably cracked, and I was ready to shatter it completely. I resolved then that she would face a reckoning that would leave no room for denial or escape. Every secret, every lie would be brought into the light, and in that moment of unvarnished truth, she would understand that the price of deception was far greater than she had ever imagined. With my plan meticulously laid out, I prepared to confront her in a way that would change everything. An act that would not only secure my future, but would also send an unambiguous message. In the game of betrayal, the truth is the ultimate weapon, and I am the one who wields it without mercy. I had reached the point where every detail, every meticulously gathered piece of evidence, was now a stepping stone towards the final act of retribution. A plan so perfect in its cold calculation that even the smallest chance for escape had been eliminated. I did not lash out or succumb to uncontrolled anger. Instead, I set my mind to work like a finely tuned machine. Every move I made from that moment on was deliberate and exact, designed not only to secure my assets and safeguard my future, but to ensure that Lena would be left with nothing more than the bitter taste of her own deception. I began by focusing on the financial foundation of our shared life, the very cornerstone of the empire that had once been tarnished by her betrayals. Quietly, I transferred every joint asset into separate holdings, carefully reassigning every dollar into accounts that were now solely in my name. I spent long, sleepless nights poring over bank statements, contracts, and legal documents, making sure that every transaction was documented, every clause reinforced to prevent any lingering claim she might try to revive. My financial discipline, which she had always mocked as dull and unromantic, was now my greatest weapon, and with each signature I affixed and every electronic transfer I executed, I felt a growing surge of control over the very future that she had once taken for granted. I knew that the public face of our company had been marred by her reckless behavior, but I also understood that behind the scenes, I had built something solid, a network of assets, investments, and legal protections that would be the bulwark against any attempt by her to reclaim power. I spent hours drafting and rewriting my will, ensuring that the legacy of our business and every investment we had made would remain untouched by her mismanagement. I carefully prepared new legal documents, ones that not only secured the assets but also outlined contingencies that would, in the worst-case scenario, frame her in a light so damning that even the regulatory bodies would have no choice but to act. In a calculated decision that left no room for error, I planted documents and evidence that would later serve as a trap. If things went sideways, they would point directly to her own financial misconduct and misappropriation of funds. With a sense of quiet satisfaction, I knew that every step had been orchestrated to leave her with no recourse. Yet I was not content to merely secure the money and the business. I needed a final, decisive blow that would serve as the symbol of my complete triumph. I began consulting with a trusted friend in the pharmaceutical field, a man whose expertise in untraceable compounds was legendary among discreet circles. In hushed conversations, away from prying eyes, I learned about a fast-acting poison, one that was completely untraceable and, when used in the right dose, would cause a nearly instantaneous reaction that would leave no doubt as to its lethal nature. I spent days researching every detail, confirming its potency and, more importantly, ensuring that its administration would be undetectable in forensic analysis. I recalled the way Lena had once threatened me with poisoned wine, her whispered suggestion that I should say my goodbyes, and I resolved that the irony of fate would not escape me. Instead of the glass meant for me, I would ensure that her own glass, on the very night of our anniversary dinner at Le Blanc, would be laced with the poison. Every move was planned with clinical precision. I made arrangements with discreet suppliers, arranged for a dosage that was both effective and undetectable, and confirmed with my pharmaceutical friend that the compound would leave no trace once it had done its work. I rehearsed the sequence in my mind over and over again. Lena, already basking in her delusional sense of victory, would unsuspectingly take a sip from her glass. The poison would enter her system, and within minutes, the signs of its effect would become painfully apparent. I had designed the plan so that every contingency was accounted for, from the possibility of her realizing what was happening to the chance that someone might try to intervene. I arranged for my personal security team to ensure that the scene would be controlled, that no one would leave or disturb the proceedings until the tragic inevitability had unfolded exactly as I intended. And I made sure that every detail of our shared history was now sealed in legal documents and financial records, so that if the authorities ever sought to understand how I had managed to secure my assets so decisively, the answer would lie in the cold, unyielding evidence I had amassed over months of quiet diligence. Every act of transferring funds, every careful redirection of business dealings, had been done not out of vengeance for vengeance's sake, but as the natural progression of a man who would not allow betrayal to dictate the terms of his life. I took a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of my plan solidify within me, and realized that I had finally reached the point where my personal empire was no longer shared. It was mine alone, built on the foundation of every calculated move and every moment of silent observation. In that moment, I knew that if Lena ever attempted to challenge the truth, if she ever tried to reclaim her role in our shared narrative, the evidence and the legal structures I had put in place would ensure that she would find herself isolated, both financially and legally. The perfect plan was not just a means of revenge. It was a declaration of independence, a final, irrevocable act that affirmed my right to control my destiny. I reviewed every detail one last time, confirming that each step was flawless and that every potential loophole had been closed. With the plan in place and the poison selected, I was now ready to move into the final phase of my meticulously orchestrated retribution, a phase that would be executed with the same cold, calculated precision that had defined every moment of my journey. I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing that the culmination of my efforts would soon come to pass, and that by that final act, every betrayal, every whispered lie, would be repaid in full. In the quiet of my office, with the faint hum of the city as my only witness, I resolved that this was the moment where I would claim absolute victory over a past steeped in deceit and betrayal, a moment where the perfect plan would finally come to fruition, sealing my fate as the master of my own destiny and ensuring that those who had dared to deceive me would be left with nothing but the echoes of their own downfall. The night of our anniversary dinner at Le Blanc arrived with an air of tension that belied the outward celebration, and as I prepared to execute the final phase of my meticulously crafted plan, every detail of the evening resonated with the inevitability of retribution. I had spent months constructing a fortress of evidence and securing every asset, and now, as I sat at a table adorned with elegant silverware and flickering candles that cast soft shadows across polished surfaces, I knew that this was the night where my carefully orchestrated moves would come to fruition. The restaurant was bustling with the sound of light chatter and the clinking of glasses, yet beneath that veneer of festivity lay an undercurrent of quiet anticipation. I had arranged everything with a precision that left no room for error, and while my guests were oblivious to the storm that had been brewing behind my calm exterior, I was silently counting down the minutes until the final act would begin. Across the table, Lena sat with a confident smile that masked the treachery I had long suspected, and to her right, Daniel occupied his seat with an air of self-assurance that now seemed increasingly fragile. They exchanged whispered words and subtle glances, their demeanor betraying nothing of the chaos that would soon upend their carefully constructed reality. As the main course was served, I maintained a polite smile and engaged in light conversation with our guests, all the while keeping my focus on the glass in front of me, one that I had ensured would play a critical role in the night's unfolding. I had, with deliberate cunning, orchestrated the switching of our glasses, so that while Lena was expecting the taste of a harmless celebratory wine, the liquid in her glass had been tampered with using the untraceable poison I had acquired with meticulous care. I remembered how she had once laughed at me, dismissing my careful financial discipline as mundane and unromantic, and now, in that very moment, it was that same discipline that had become the instrument of her downfall. With every sip she took, I could see the subtle flicker of confusion cross her face, a fleeting moment that I registered with the same calm, measured gaze I had maintained through every other act of this long game of betrayal. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The wine's flavor appeared unchanged, the red liquid shimmering in the candlelight as it did every other time. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice a slight pallor creeping into her complexion, her eyes flickering with an uncertainty that was unlike the confident glimmer they had held earlier in the night. A sudden convulsion seized her hand, and I saw the color draining from her face as the realization of what was happening finally struck her. The restaurant, which had been a stage for our public celebration, now became an arena for the collapse of her carefully maintained facade. In that moment, I stood, my own emotions hidden behind a mask of stoic composure, and watched as Lena's body began to betray her. Her face contorting in pain, her breath coming in shallow gasps, until she finally slumped forward, her chair sliding back from the force of her collapse. The sound of her body hitting the floor was muffled by the soft background music and the sudden, stunned silence that fell over the room as guests began to murmur in disbelief. Daniel's smirk, which had so arrogantly adorned his features only minutes before, faltered and then vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of shock that mirrored the horror of the unfolding scene. I moved swiftly yet deliberately, calling out for help in a voice that was calm and measured, as though I were orchestrating a final symphony rather than reacting to a tragedy. Emergency services were summoned with efficiency, and within moments, paramedics rushed in, their urgent footsteps and clipped commands creating a stark contrast to the previously elegant ambience. I maintained my composure, knowing that every moment now was critical for ensuring that the full weight of the evidence would stand undisputed. As Lena lay there, barely conscious and surrounded by a swirl of panicked voices and flashing lights, I leaned in and whispered the final words that I had rehearsed countless times in the quiet solitude of my study. "You deceived me in love. Now see the end. Goodbye, my dear." My voice was low and resolute, each word echoing with the silent promise of retribution that had been building since that fateful birthday toast. The words were not shouted in anger, nor were they whispered in bitterness. They were simply stated, a final declaration that her treachery had come with an irreversible cost. I felt no immediate surge of satisfaction as I watched her fade further into unconsciousness. Only a cold, unyielding certainty that this was the moment where everything had irrevocably changed. In that charged, dismal scene, while the paramedics worked tirelessly to stabilize her and the shocked murmurs of onlookers filled the air, I turned away from the chaos and retreated into the shadows of the night. I knew that this was the night of no return, the moment that had sealed her fate and irrevocably rewritten the course of my life. Each step I took away from the restaurant was measured and resolute, every stride carrying the weight of the long, arduous journey that had led to this final act of vindication. Though the night was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the distant wail of sirens, I felt only the quiet, steady pulse of retribution, the assurance that every betrayal, every deception, would ultimately be repaid in full. As I disappeared into the darkness, the echoes of that final whispered goodbye lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that in the intricate dance of love and betrayal, the truth, when wielded with cold precision, could be the deadliest weapon of all. In the quiet chaos that followed the tragic events at LeBlanc, the world around me seemed to hold its breath in a suspended state of disbelief and sorrow, yet I found within myself a steady resolve that had grown stronger with each passing moment of my meticulously executed plan. The restaurant, once an elegant haven for celebration, now lay shrouded in a somber pall as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Lena, while the murmurs of shocked guests reverberated off the walls in a dissonant chorus. I stood at the periphery of it all, my expression unreadable, as I watched the scene unfold with a detached clarity that belied the tumultuous storm of emotions that had raged within me since that fateful toast. The flashing red and blue lights outside, the hurried whispers of onlookers, and the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, forming a backdrop to a public spectacle that would soon be dissected by the media and scrutinized by authorities. I knew that in the aftermath, the narrative would be twisted to cast me as either a grieving husband or a cold-hearted man whose calculated actions bordered on the unthinkable. But I had prepared for this outcome too. Every move, every detail had been orchestrated to secure not only my assets and my future, but also to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge from the labyrinth of lies that Lena had spun. As the paramedics loaded Lena onto a stretcher, her pale, fading form a stark testament to the irreversible consequences of betrayal, I could feel the weight of countless hours spent poring over legal documents and financial records bearing down on me. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages and calls. From investors seeking reassurance, from close friends offering cautious condolences, and from the media hungry for details of the unfolding scandal. I answered only the most essential calls, my tone calm and measured as I reiterated that everything was under control and that the integrity of our shared empire, now solely mine, would not be compromised by this personal tragedy. Behind the facade of a grieving husband, I maintained the cold, calculated control that had been my anchor throughout the entire ordeal. I recalled the moment Lena had whispered her final words as she collapsed, her voice a haunting echo of the betrayal that had fueled my every action, and I knew that despite the public outcry and the tearful pleas of those who had once celebrated her, the scales of justice were already tipping in my favor. In the hours that followed, the media descended upon the scene like vultures, capturing every detail with a ferocity that both sickened and steeled me. News headlines blared about a corporate betrayal and poisoning scandal, and the chatter among the high society that had once toasted to Lena's supposed new beginning now turned to whispers of a fallen empire. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the truth, once obscured by Lena's charm and cunning, began to seep into public consciousness. Investors started to distance themselves, and within days, the regulatory bodies were probing into the financial discrepancies that had long been hidden behind layers of deceit. I knew that while the immediate shock of the incident would soon fade from public memory, the long-term consequences for Lena, and for those who had enabled her treachery, would be irreversible. I spent the remainder of that night in my penthouse, the cold glow of the city below serving as a reminder that life, even in the wake of devastation, continued unabated. I reviewed the flood of emails and messages with a practiced detachment, ensuring that every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered would be securely archived and ready to be presented to the appropriate authorities when the time came. My mind replayed every moment from that dreadful dinner, the calculated smile on my face as I raised my glass, the final whispered words that sealed Lena's fate, and the icy resolve in my eyes as I walked away from the carnage. It was a montage of triumph and tragedy, interwoven in a tapestry of revenge that had taken years to craft and one night to execute. The silence that followed was not one of relief, but of a resolute determination, a promise to myself that no matter how bitter the fallout, I would not let this moment define me as a broken man. Instead, it would become the catalyst for my rebirth, a transformation that would reassert my control over both my personal life and the business empire that I had so diligently built. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the city slowly began to stir and the first hints of light crept over the horizon, I penned a final series of instructions to my legal team, ensuring that every facet of the business would remain insulated from the chaos of the scandal. I restructured contracts, finalized asset transfers, and meticulously updated all records to reflect that all shared investments and properties were now solely mine. This was not merely an act of self-preservation but a declaration that betrayal, no matter how deeply it cut, would ultimately yield to the relentless power of discipline and foresight. With the morning news beginning to broadcast images of Lena in distress, and with the investigation slowly turning its relentless gaze toward the inconsistencies in her financial dealings, I sat back and allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, legal battles, public scrutiny, and the inevitable murmurs of those who questioned my methods. But I was resolute. Every step I had taken, every calculated maneuver, had led me to this point, where the truth was emerging from the shadows and every secret had been laid bare. In that moment, as the city awoke and the scars of the previous night slowly began to heal, I raised my glass of whiskey in a silent toast. A toast not to revenge, but to the unyielding strength that had allowed me to reclaim my life from the wreckage of betrayal. And so, with the cold, clear light of day promising a future unburdened by the lies of the past, I stepped forward into a new era, fully aware that while the aftermath of this tragedy would forever mark the pages of our history, it was my determination and unyielding resolve that would define the legacy of what I had reclaimed. In the days following the public fallout of Lena's collapse at Loup Blanc, while the chaos of that night still lingered like a bad dream in the corridors of power, I set my next plan into motion with the steady, measured precision of someone who had long prepared for every eventuality. I had already witnessed the intricate web of lies that Lena had spun, each strand meticulously woven to hide her betrayal, but I knew there was one thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry: her secret liaison with Travis. Travis, a wealthy investor whose name Lena had mentioned with admiration on numerous occasions, had always seemed to occupy a shadowy space in her narrative, a figure whose charm and fortune were seemingly at odds with the careful financial discipline I had cultivated. I had grown suspicious of his sudden, unexplained appearances in her life and his conspicuous absence from the financial records that I had so meticulously maintained. With the evidence of Lena's infidelities mounting, I resolved to expose Travis as the fraud he was, a man whose entire career was built on shady dealings and inflated returns that threatened to collapse under the weight of indisputable truth. Late one night, as I sat in my study reviewing yet another set of documents, I began the process of setting the trap that would lead to Travis's downfall. I drafted an anonymous package, meticulously compiling all the evidence I had gathered over the months. Intercepted communications, bank records that showed unaccounted for transfers during the nights Lena claimed were spent with clients, and even a series of surveillance photos taken from the penthouse that I had arranged to monitor Lena's secret meetings. Every document was carefully annotated, cross-referenced, and then sealed within a plain envelope. I then sent this package to the local branch of the Securities and Exchange Commission, making sure that the chain of custody was unbreakable and that no trace of my involvement would be discovered. I knew that once the package was in their hands, the authorities would be forced to take a closer look at Travis's financial dealings, and soon enough, the cracks in his carefully constructed career would begin to show. The days that followed were tense, as I monitored news reports and regulatory communications with the quiet anticipation of a man who had been preparing for this moment for far too long. I received discreet updates from a trusted contact within the SEC, who confirmed that Travis's accounts were under intense scrutiny and that irregularities in his financial statements were beginning to surface. His once impenetrable network of fraudulent investments and secretive offshore accounts was now being dismantled, one piece of evidence at a time. I watched with a detached satisfaction as whispers turned into full-blown public shaming. Investors who had once eagerly thrown their support behind him were now distancing themselves, and rumors of lawsuits began to circulate among the elite circles of the business world. Travis, who had once exuded an air of untouchable confidence, now appeared increasingly agitated in public appearances, his speeches filled with half-hearted assurances that did little to mask the desperation in his eyes. One morning, as I reviewed the latest regulatory report from my secure line, I received a short message from an intermediary, a trusted lawyer who had been assisting me with the financial restructuring. The message read simply, "Travis is panicking. His accounts are flagged for fraud. Major investors are pulling out. He is scheduled for intense interrogation next week." A cold smile crept over my face as I realized that my silent campaign was working perfectly. In the ruthless world of finance, reputation was everything, and Travis's crumbling facade was a damning testament to his incompetence and deceit. His downfall, which had once seemed like a distant possibility, was now unfolding in real time, and I took comfort in knowing that every secret he had tried to bury would soon come to light. In the midst of this financial and social unraveling, I began to notice that the media, ever hungry for scandal, were picking up on the story. Headlines began to appear, framing Travis as the prime suspect in a scandal of corporate fraud and betrayal, a stark contrast to the image of the suave, sophisticated investor he had cultivated over the years. Every television broadcast, every online article, painted a picture of a man whose empire was built on sand, collapsing under the weight of its own duplicity. I remained silent, careful not to attract any attention to myself, letting the unfolding scandal serve as the final blow to Lena's carefully orchestrated world of deceit. My public persona, that of a grieving husband who had suffered immense personal loss, was now being reinforced by the very downfall of those who had betrayed me. The narrative was shifting irrevocably, and the public was beginning to see that the truth, cold, calculated, and unyielding, could not be suppressed forever. I made sure to keep my own distance, watching the developments with a quiet detachment that belied the storm of emotions within me. The fall of Travis was not just a personal victory. It was a statement to all who had doubted my ability to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I took comfort in the knowledge that the very traits I had long been mocked for, my financial discipline, my careful planning, my relentless pursuit of truth, had become the instruments of my retribution. As the SEC launched a full-scale investigation into Travis's financial dealings and his network of deceit began to crumble, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Every investor who had once applauded his promises was now left reeling, every business partner now questioning the legitimacy of his claims. And in that maelstrom of unraveling lies, I stood firm, the quiet orchestrator of a downfall that was as inevitable as it was just. In the end, Travis's world collapsed completely. His reputation, his wealth, his very identity as a successful investor were now nothing more than a cautionary tale in boardrooms and financial reports. I had ensured that every trace of his fraudulent activities was exposed, leaving him with no escape from the long arm of justice. And as I observed the final stages of his unraveling, I knew that this was a turning point not only for him, but for me as well. A moment when the scales of power had finally tipped, and the truth had prevailed over the lies that had once bound our fates together. I sat alone in my study that evening, the soft glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the meticulously organized files that chronicled every betrayal and every secret I had uncovered. The silence of the room was punctuated only by the low hum of my computer and the steady ticking of an old clock, a reminder that time, like truth, waits for no one. It was then that an email notification flashed onto my screen, its subject line stark and foreboding, "You'll regret this." My heart, already steeled by months of relentless investigation and cold calculation, skipped a beat as I hesitated before clicking the message open. I had long prepared for this moment, the possibility that Lena, in her final desperate act, would leave behind a parting shot, a recording, a message, something meant to twist the narrative in her favor even after her collapse. As I read the email, Lena's voice filled my mind with a haunting familiarity. In the recorded message, her tone was raw and conflicted, laced with bitterness and regret. She confessed that she had orchestrated her own betrayal to free herself from what she called a stifling marriage, yet she admitted that her plan went further than she had ever intended. She revealed, with trembling words, that she had planned to take everything from me, to vanish with Travis into a life of unbridled luxury while leaving me to shoulder the burdens of loss and humiliation. What struck me most, however, was her mention of another accomplice, her younger sister, Ava, who, according to Lena's final message, had been in on the plan all along. Lena warned that Ava might hold the final piece of the puzzle, that she might know truths that could unravel everything I had so carefully secured. I leaned back in my chair, a cold, measured fury rising within me as the implications sank in. Lena's words were a final, desperate plea, a spectral echo of the betrayal that had set my entire course of action into motion. In that moment, I realized that the past was not done with me yet, that the dead could still speak through their final messages, and that I now faced a new threat. Ava, with her youthful defiance and hidden ambitions, was the last loose end that could jeopardize the empire I had painstakingly rebuilt from the wreckage of our shared past. Determined not to allow her to disrupt the balance I had so carefully established, I immediately forwarded the email, along with all the evidence I had gathered, to my legal team and trusted advisors. I needed to ensure that every shred of truth was documented, every possibility of Ava's interference anticipated. I spent the next several hours poring over our records, cross-referencing every transaction, every detail that Lena had left behind. I reinforced the legal barriers I had already constructed, double-checking that no contingency existed that could be exploited by someone seeking to upend the narrative. Even as I worked, the email's words echoed in my mind, a final threat that resonated with a mix of regret and defiance. I recalled the day of that fateful birthday, when Lena had declared her betrayal with such theatrical cruelty, and how I had vowed then that every betrayal would eventually be repaid in full. Now, Lena's parting words were a stark reminder that the debt of betrayal was not yet settled. I resolved that if Ava ever made a move, I would confront her head-on, exposing every lie and every hidden secret that had allowed our lives to become so disastrously entwined. The thought of facing her, of unmasking her as the final piece in this intricate web of deception, filled me with a quiet determination that bordered on icy resolve. I reached for my phone and sent a terse message to my security detail, instructing them to monitor any unusual activity related to Ava, an order that left no room for negotiation. I knew that the public narrative had already turned against Lena and Travis, and now I had to ensure that Ava's potential meddling would not disrupt the carefully constructed future I had fought so hard to secure. As the evening wore on and the soft rustle of papers continued to my relentless work, I allowed myself a moment of introspection. The email, with its chilling finality, forced me to confront the reality that betrayal leaves behind ghosts. Ghosts that, even in death, try to speak and shape the future. Yet, as I considered every step I had taken to secure my empire, every meticulously planned maneuver, I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that I had not left anything to chance. The past, with all its dark secrets, was locked away in legal documents and financial records that bore testimony to my unwavering resolve. And while Lena's final message might have been meant as a threat, it only served to galvanize my determination to eradicate every trace of her influence, and that of anyone who might seek to resurrect her treacherous legacy. With a final, resolute nod, I closed the email and returned to my work, fully aware that the final act of this long, twisted saga was yet to come. Ava's potential arrival loomed on the horizon as a specter of unfinished business, but I was ready. I would meet her challenge with the same cold, calculated precision that had defined every moment of my journey from humiliation to unyielding victory. In the quiet of that night, as the city outside slumbered and the echoes of past betrayals slowly faded into the background, I made a silent vow. No matter what form the final threat took, I would be there to confront it, to expose it, and ultimately to ensure that the legacy of deception would be purged from my life once and for all. And with that unspoken promise echoing in the silence, I pressed forward into the unknown, a man fortified by the unassailable power of truth and unwavering determination. I remember the moment when the quiet murmur of daily life was shattered by the arrival of a series of anonymous threats, cryptic messages, a vandalized car, broken glass near my front door, and unsettling texts that carried the unmistakable tone of retribution. I had spent months orchestrating my revenge with meticulous care, ensuring that every asset was secured and every piece of evidence against Lena and her cohorts was gathered, and now, as I reviewed the latest message on my phone, I felt an icy chill run down my spine. The message simply read, "I know what you did. The game isn't over." It was unsigned, but I knew all too well that it was from Ava, the one loose end, the final accomplice Lena had once trusted implicitly, whose loyalty had shifted with the winds of betrayal. My heart, once steeled by cold determination, now pounded with the realization that my perfectly constructed plan was in danger of unraveling. Ava's name, whispered in the dark corridors of our shared past, now loomed as a potential threat to everything I had painstakingly rebuilt. I recalled every moment that had led me to this point. The fateful birthday when Lena's announcement had turned our celebration into a mockery of my honor, the silent disappearance that had allowed me to secure our finances without her interference, and the painstaking investigation that had unveiled her hidden affairs and secret alliances. Now, with Ava's anonymous threats echoing in the background, the hunter had become the hunted, and my carefully planned revenge was at risk of being undone by an unexpected twist. Determined not to let this new threat disrupt my victory, I immediately contacted my security detail, instructing them to double-check every entrance, every exit, and to keep a vigilant eye on any unusual activity, especially any sign of Ava. I also reached out to my legal team, ensuring that every precaution was taken to safeguard the assets and the evidence that had made my retribution possible. As the day wore on, I began to notice small signs that my worst fears were materializing. A misplaced phone call, a shadow in the reflection of my window, and later, an ominous note taped to my office door that simply said, "I'm coming for you." It was as if the roles had been reversed, and now I, the one who had meticulously dismantled Lena's empire and ensured that every betrayal was repaid, was being cornered by a vengeful ghost from the past. With every new threat, the tension in my meticulously ordered life grew, and I knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. One cold evening, I received a summons, a message that Ava wanted to meet, to settle matters once and for all, at a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. The invitation was vague, but it carried an unmistakable promise of undeniable proof of my guilt, a final twist in a story that I had thought was already written in my favor. I prepared carefully for the meeting, not out of fear, but with the same calculated resolve that had defined my every move thus far. I made sure that my car was tracked by my security team, that my phone was on a secure line, and that every potential escape route was mapped out in case the situation turned dangerous. The meeting took place at a deserted cafe, a place chosen for its isolation and the quiet anonymity it offered. I arrived early, my mind racing through every possible outcome, every contingency that could arise. Moments later, Ava arrived, her face set in a mixture of defiance and regret, her eyes betraying a desperation that I recognized all too well. As we sat across from each other at a worn wooden table, the ambient noise of the few other patrons faded into an oppressive silence, as if the world itself were waiting for our confrontation to begin. Ava began to speak haltingly, her voice quivering as she produced a small recorder from her bag. "I have something you need to see," she said, her tone pleading yet resolute. With trembling hands, she pressed play, and Lena's voice filled the room. A recording captured in a moment of vulnerability, where her words, tinged with doubt and remorse, revealed that she had planned to take everything from me and vanish with Travis, leaving me to bear the weight of betrayal and financial ruin. The recording was damning, its every syllable a testament to the deceit that had been the cornerstone of Lena's treachery. I listened silently, my expression unreadable, as the truth of her words confirmed the very foundation of my suspicions and validated every calculated move I had made. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the air was thick with tension and the unspoken implications of the recording. Then, with a measured, cold precision, I leaned forward and asked, "And what do you want from me, Ava?" Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears and burning with a mix of anger and fear, met mine as she replied, "I want you to know that you're not the only one who can play this game." Before I could respond, I felt an unsettling pressure as I glanced at her untouched glass of wine. I realized then that Ava, like Lena before her, had a plan, a final, twisted gambit meant to turn the tables on me. In that instant, I made a decision. I would not let her have the final word. I slowly reached into my own pocket and, with a deliberate calm, removed a small vial of the same untraceable poison I had so carefully prepared for Lena's end. With a steady hand, I uncorked the vial and, in a single, fluid motion, poured its contents into her glass, ensuring that the measure was exact and that every potential clue to my involvement would vanish with the final act of retribution. The irony of it was brutal. Here she was, seeking to expose me, to unmask me as the mastermind behind our shared downfall, and yet, in her attempt to control the narrative, she became the victim of the very strategy one had honed over the months of meticulous planning. I watched as her eyes widened in disbelief, the color draining from her face as the poison began to take its irreversible toll. Her hand trembled as she lifted the glass, and for a fraction of a second, time seemed to suspend itself as she took a tentative sip. Then, as if the final curtain had been drawn, her features contorted with shock, and she slumped forward, her body betraying the fatal effects of my carefully orchestrated plan. I leaned back, my voice barely above a whisper, and with the cold, final words that had become my signature in the face of betrayal, I murmured, "I always win." In that chilling moment, as Ava collapsed and the quiet clamor of the deserted cafe filled the void left by her falling, I stood as the victor in a game where every move had been calculated, every betrayal repaid in kind. The hunter had indeed become the master of his fate, and with both Lena and Ava now silenced by the inexorable force of truth and retribution, I walked away from that final meeting with the knowledge that my empire, my legacy, and my unyielding resolve had triumphed over the deceptions of the past.